Now that you've introduced this question of unsuccessful political campaigns, I'm tempted to go further, but I shan't. We're very honored this evening to have as our speaker Professor Richard Niestadt, who has been professor of government at Columbia University since 1954. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1951, and he has also taught at Columbia, Princeton, Cornell, and most recently at Oxford in England. This reads like something of a rogues gallery of academic excellence, and gives you some idea of the stature of our speaker this evening. He is, I believe, the ideal combination of academic excellence and broad political experience. He is a scholar politician. His most famous work is a book called Presidential Power, which was published in 1960. It is one of the most widely read, as distinguished from most widely talked about, books in American political science, and also one of the most influential. This book appeared in 1960. One has one's suspicions about why it happened to come out during such a year, but in any event it did. It came to the attention of President-elect Kennedy and received what must have been one of the greatest advertising boosts in the history of publishing, from being widely circulated. The information was widely circulated in the press that President-elect Kennedy was reading this book while lounging on the beaches of Palm Beach between the time of his election and his inauguration. Professor Niestadt has had a wide variety of experience in and out of government, which I shall not attempt to go into in any detail. I shall quote only some of the more impressive elements of his experience. He was assistant to the director of the Bureau of the Budget from 1946 to 1949. Somewhere along in there, he managed to pick up his doctorate from Harvard in 1951. He was then special assistant to President Truman in the White House from 1950 until the end of President Truman's administration. I have it on nearly the highest authority that Professor Niestadt was a particular favorite of President Truman's and was privy to most of the major decisions during this period, and indeed participated in them at the highest level. He also has served as a consultant to congressional committees, and he is currently in the capacity of consultant to 3 governmental bodies in Washington. One wonders what the fees for consultants are in Washington these days. For someone to be a consultant to 3 of them must put him in the higher stratosphere of academic rewards. In any event, he has also most recently appeared before Senator Henry Jackson's subcommittee, which is studying, once again, the administration of national security. This committee, which made a memorable contribution to the study of the policy process in the United States over the past few years, has now been reconstituted and is holding hearings which began in March of this year. The first 3 witnesses were General Loris Niestadt, who had recently retired as commander of NATO forces and had a word or two to say about the policy process. The second was Averell Harriman, who is probably more experienced in governmental affairs than any living human, with the exception of the ex-presidents. And the third witness before this committee to provide his expert testimony was the speaker of the evening, Professor Niestadt. I would like to quote just one sentence from his testimony, which was brief, concise, and pungent. But I should like to quote just this one sentence about the presidency, which he spoke at that time. The sitting president lives daily with the knowledge that at any time he personally may have to make a human judgment or may fail to control someone else's judgment, which puts half the world in jeopardy and cannot be called back. You and I will recognize his burden intellectually, he actually experiences it emotionally. It cannot help but set him and his needs sharply apart from all the rest of us. Now, it's impossible to bridge this gap of apartness between us and the President, but if anyone can do it, Professor Niestadt can. He is perhaps today the leading authority on the American presidency. It is a great privilege to present a distinguished scholar and an accomplished politician, Professor Niestadt.
Thank you. If I were to attempt to amend that introduction for your protection and the accuracy of the record, it would take all our time here. Suffice it to say that I never consult more than one government agency at a time. Also, perhaps, that my chief utility to the Jackson Subcommittee's recent hearings was that I was the one professor whom they had not heard in their last set of hearings because I was then overseas. Now, what I have to talk about tonight is all wrapped up in that quote just given you. A quote from me, so naturally I'll prove it. We are here talking about vital centers of decision. And surely presidential decisions are vital and central in our time. In the realm of politics, above the person but beneath space, they are of the order of the most vital decisions known to us. But my title tonight is in some ways a deceiving one. The promise of presidential leadership. This conjures up all kinds of visions with which I shall have little to do here. Conjures up congressional box scores of numbers of measures passed in the president's program versus numbers rejected. Or images of Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, his appeals to the people directly. Or Teddy Roosevelt's phrase about the presidency as a bloody pulpit. Leadership as persuasion. It's persuasion of governmental bodies or of public opinion to move in directions in which the president wants to go. Now, these are traditional terms of presidential leadership and perfectly valid ones. They are valid, but I think they are quite insufficient today. There is at least one sphere of action in which effective leadership has got to be expressed in different terms. In terms of the effectiveness of judgment as to where to go, and the effectiveness of communication of decision. For in one sphere at least, the president has ability to act commensurate with his responsibility. This is the military sphere, the employment of military power. In the foreground of decision, as in the Cuban case, or in the background of decision, as in the whole sweep of our conduct of diplomacy today. It is in this sphere, in a very down-to-earth sense, the most vital of all decisions in the realm of politics stand to be taken today. But if this is so, to talk about the promise of presidential leadership is to talk in terms of the effectiveness of judgment, not the effectiveness of persuasion. For in other realms, in the realms of legislation, in the realms of domestic welfare programs, in the preservation of the domestic peace, the president's responsibility materially exceeds his assured capacity to carry through. He does not have the power. He must therefore persuade those who have it to use it in the direction he wants it used. In this sphere, however, that most fundamental of all spheres in politics, the sphere of force, the president does have the assured power to carry through decisions. In this sphere, it is the effectiveness of judgment, not of persuasion, that one must use as a standard for measuring effective leadership. It is to this that I would turn tonight. We have, in a number of ways, a new presidency. A presidency quite unlike presidencies we've known in the past. A presidency illustrated by that thing I was quoted as saying presidents must live with. Let me try to illustrate for you in what the newness consists. Let me illustrate to begin with an illustration drawn not from the immediate past, but from a decade or more ago. In September 1950, President Truman directed General MacArthur, after his victory, which followed the Incheon landings, to pursue the North Korean forces north of the 38th parallel, the boundary that had existed before the war, to pursue the enemy, to destroy the enemy, and to occupy the northern half of the country. Now, this directive gave MacArthur considerable discretion. It also placed upon him numbers of cautions. He was to carry on as long as he saw possibility that these objectives could be achieved without inviting or running into serious interference from Soviet or Chinese sources. The directive gave him leeway, in general terms suggested cautions. MacArthur proceeded. He proceeded following the forces he was directed to destroy, and they proceeded to advance ahead of him, or to retreat ahead of him. In late October, when he had occupied virtually the whole peninsula, North Korean resistance began to stiffen, and part of the stiffening turned out to be what were called Chinese volunteers. And there came a pause in General MacArthur's calculations and in Washington's concerns, in which both looked with concern on the possible dangers involved in proceeding to carry forward this directive. Washington continued to be concerned. MacArthur's concern faded as October turned into November. In Washington, there was debate as to whether MacArthur's directive should be altered. But it was decided to let it stand temporarily while Washington investigated Chinese intentions and attempted to explore the diplomatic possibilities. So the directive stood. MacArthur proceeded to execute it on his discretion. He moved while Washington explored, till finally, when his forces were divided, proceeding east and west to complete the occupation of Korea, a Chinese force struck from behind our lines, not before them, and the net result was virtually to sweep the Americans off the peninsula, to return them to the perimeter from which their advance had begun in mid-September. Now, what does this suggest? It suggests several things. It suggests, in the first place, that in contrast to some other actors with whom a president must deal, the American armed forces does what it is told. Congress may not pass bills. Steel manufacturers may not happily or forever hold their price line. Even executive officials may balk at executing presidential orders, but in our military tradition, the armed services will do what they are told. In the respect of the use of force, the President's decision is virtually tantamount to action. Even General MacArthur did what he was told. The telling may have been ambiguous, but insofar as he was given directives, he followed them. And when, in March, he began to sabotage further directives which he saw in prospect, the President discharged him. And it can be said for General MacArthur that his final orders he followed to the letter. Our military tradition is quite unlike the French. It builds support for civil authority, and orders by civil authority are traditionally obeyed with alacrity. But a military organization, like other organizations in contemporary life, is a large-scale enterprise. Once set in motion, it is not easily checked. Bureaucratic momentum is not easily reversed. Once one had ordered MacArthur to proceed in pursuit of enemy forces to the extent he thought safe, a whole train of following orders was set in motion. A whole huge organization was set in motion. And to stop what had been started could not have been easy. Furthermore, once large-scale bureaucratic action goes into motion, with the accelerating momentum this involves, one runs a risk that one's adversaries may perceive and calculate the results of this activity quite differently than one anticipated. So far as we know, the North Korean attack on South Korea, which was built, supported, authorized by the Soviets, was not expected in Moscow to induce direct American intervention on the other side. South Korea evidently looked like cheap real estate to be picked up quickly. The American reaction was not anticipated. From the Soviet point of view, the Soviet North Korean point of view, bureaucratic momentum was complicated by miscalculation about adversaries' intentions. And so, in October and November 1950, Washington and Tokyo, Truman and MacArthur, miscalculated Chinese intentions. Each side is capable simultaneously of miscalculating the intentions of the other. The net result is that either by virtue of bureaucratic momentum or by virtue of mutual miscalculation, or both combined, a judgment involving the use of force, a decision involving the use of force, may readily become irreversible. This is not true of most domestic policy decisions. In Franklin Roosevelt's early months, for example, months of drastic decision-making, at a time when, unlike our usual time, the President's authority in domestic spheres was as great as in military spheres, when Congress was effectively prepared to do whatever he suggested. Here, he decided virtually nothing, started virtually nothing, that could not be called back, couldn't be stopped, couldn't be tried, and if found wanting, played over, reversed. Every approach was tentative. Every action had in it the possibility of reversal and renewal with another course of action. But this is not so with Mr. Truman's decision to send MacArthur forward. Beyond a point, this action became irreversible. Now, there's great risk in irreversibility. It's not a new thing, and it's not a new risk. As long ago as 1914, Emperor Wilhelm reacted with great excitement to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and authorized dispatches from his government which gave Vienna what was later called a blank check. Before Vienna acted, the emperor and his civil authorities had become extremely unhappy about the blankness of their check. But by that time, the chiefs of staff had taken over. By that time, it was too late. Momentum made it too late. Miscalculations about Russian reactions, British reactions, French reactions rapidly made it still later. Beyond a certain point, the first reaction led to consequences which were irreversible. This is nothing new. Yet, while there is nothing new in Truman's situation in Korea, nothing new in the risk of irreversibility, as far as Truman is concerned, something still newer than this has been added to the situation of an American presidential decision maker in this sphere. The risk of irreversibility is a much harder risk for Mr. Kennedy than it was for Mr. Truman. In 1953, in his farewell message to Congress, Mr. Truman penned a warning to Joseph Stalin. Lenin, Truman said, was a pre-atomic man who viewed history and society through pre-atomic eyes. Something profound has happened since he wrote. War has changed its shape and its dimension. Yet in a way, Truman's situation, relative to now, was no less pre-atomic than Lenin's. Truman worked, Truman gave orders, Truman conducted the Korean War before two things had happened, which are with us now. First, hydrogen weapons. Weapons, not explosions. Hydrogen weapons fitted into intercontinental delivery systems with real capability. And such systems, this is second, in the hands not only of the United States but of the Soviet Union. Truman was not a pre-atomic man. The risks of irreversibility for him were not pre-atomic risks, but they were risks of different character than the risks that have characterized the presidential situation since mutual nuclear delivery capability came into play. This began to happen in Mr. Eisenhower's second term. Mr. Kennedy is the first president who has lived with this from the beginning of his term. It is in some ways a transformed situation. The risks of irreversibility remain. Bureaucratic momentum can still render situations irreversible. Mutual miscalculation can certainly do so. In a small way, not involving the Soviet Union. In a relatively small way, both bureaucratic momentum and multiple miscalculations were at work in what we now look back on as the Bay of Pigs. But wherever the Soviet Union is involved, however tangentially, wherever there is possibility of direct confrontation, something has been added to this older, familiar risk of irreversibility. And what has been added is the risk that irreversibility becomes irremediable. But unlike Emperor William's situation in 1914, unlike Harry Truman's situation in 1950, nothing one does later can ward off, reduce, repair, compensate for costs to one's society. Truman, after the Chinese struck, was able to rally forces, was able to redefine and limit his objectives, was able, through the use of military force, to restore the situation as it had been before his directive was issued in the first place, to restore the situation roughly as it had been after MacArthur's victory at Incha. But the possibility today, with mutual nuclear capability, the possibility exists that the irreversible decision will move in such directions that there is no room for recovery, repair, redoing. This new dimension of risk in the employment of force hangs over the head of a contemporary president, over Mr. Kennedy's and over his successors, in a way and to a degree and with a bite that was unknown as recently as Mr. Truman's time or before. It has done, as I suggested to the Jackson Subcommittee, it has set the president sharply apart from all the rest of us. Because the responsibility is his, the judgment is his, and the power to act is his, not ours. Now, not only are the risks somewhat changed in their dimension, but risks of this dangerous sort are run more frequently now than even a decade ago. Mutual capability and the worldwide scope of the struggle with the Soviet Union, say nothing of the possibilities of nuclear diffusion which lie ahead of us. These make the risks of irreversibility become irremediable lurk in the background, not of all, but of a majority of our diplomatic relations with a majority of countries in the world. These force a president to concern himself far more sharply than Mr. Truman did with the need to keep control, with the need not only to make sound judgments, but precise communications, with the need not only to give the employers of force orders, but to limit their discretion. The whole American military tradition stood behind Mr. Truman when he gave the field commander broad discretion. Yet, as we saw in the Cuban confrontation last October, that tradition has virtually ceased to exist. Last fall, it is widely and I think accurately reported, Mr. Kennedy, from the cabinet room, supervised in detail the movements of blockading warships. The treatment accorded by those warships to individual approaching merchant ships. The local admiral in control of the blockade had none of the normal discretion which in our tradition is usually accorded military commanders, and for good reason, if one considers the risks. Yet, the fact that the Cuban confrontation was a successful affair should not obscure the difficulty raised here. In many ways, the Cuban confrontation was ideally simplified, geographically, and in time and in appropriate response, nothing is more controllable, really, than a naval blockade close at hand. But suppose this had stretched out over a month or two. Or suppose there had been two such complex confrontations operating more or less simultaneously. Or suppose the geographic focus had been remote, not close at hand. Or the appropriate means had not been nice naval vessels, but complex mechanisms of another sort. Then the need for the tight control, the precise communication, which was operative in this case, would have been much harder to fulfill. And this is the other side of new dimension in a president's risk-taking, in the one area where his ability to act is as great as his responsibility. Irreversibility can be irremediable, and in keeping it from being irremediable, a degree of control and precision, as well as judgment, is required beyond anything we have experienced in the past. Now, quite obviously, the task of husbanding force and applying it wisely, controllably, carefully, the task which measures effective presidential leadership in this area where judgment, not persuasion, is the appropriate criterion. This task has tended to ramify into all kinds of policy areas, beyond the occasional area of what we used to call war, very widely into many sorts of spheres of policy in what we now, for want of a better term, call peace. But not only are many, many aspects of our diplomatic relations tinged with the problems I've posed to you tonight, but these problems naturally have to be continuously in the forefront of a president's personal concern and work attention, in a way unknown before. War was war, but when you didn't have war, you had peace. And most of the time, you had peace. But there's something more here. Not only have these matters preempted a great deal of presidential time, attention, concern. Naturally, they should and must. They have tended to ramify in very subtle ways into the operation of what I might call the old presidency, the older presidency, the presidency to which we are accustomed. Let me give you an example. Leadership in the older terms was persuasion. Congress, of members of the public, of interest groups. Effective leadership was effective persuasion. And many writers, including this one, have seen inherent in the task of public leadership, congressional leadership, the creation of division, the sharpening of support in the very process of sharpening opposition. Conflict in this country. Conflict has been the source of most change in governmental policy. Conflict, not conciliation, has been the means by which we have made what we often call progress in spheres of social welfare. Yet, the overhanging risks which present themselves to the new presidency are a powerful inhibition, I believe, against the stirring of conflict, which has always been a primary weapon in persuasion under the terms of reference of the older presidency. Mr. Eisenhower used to be accused of hoarding his prestige, unwilling to spend it, preserving his popularity, refusing to put it to the test of controversial and divisive measures. You remember this, I'm sure. Now, Mr. Kennedy is accused of precisely the same thing. Perhaps this is just that both these gentlemen had temperamental or psychological desires to be beloved. Perhaps it's that they lacked a talent for generating public opposition and hence support. Perhaps they lacked the will. Or perhaps their temperaments have nothing in common. Still, however different, both produce, as a matter of temperament, the same result. This is all quite possible. I might be willing to pass judgment on Mr. Eisenhower. I am not yet willing to pass judgment on Mr. Kennedy. As a professional observer, I generally believe that the time to begin to assess the evidence is toward the close of a second term. And if a president has only one term, he's hardly been there long enough to develop a pattern of action which is appraisable at all. So I beg off on Mr. Kennedy's temperament for now. Ask me again in 57, or 67, 68. But, clearly, it is likely that something more than temperament, same temperament, different temperament, something more than skill or lack of it in using radio and television is at work on both these presidents, and particularly on the present president, who has lived the longest and most sharply with the risks I have discussed tonight. And I dare say that the next president and the one after will find themselves inhibited, however skillful they may be, inhibited in attempting persuasion through the kind of division-making, conflict-stirring, open to our old great persuaders. For, inescapably, a president under contemporary circumstances lives with an awareness that at any time he may have to ask his fellow citizens to take on trust, on faith, on confidence, the most peculiar sorts of conduct. Conduct in overseas affairs on which average voters can bring no personal perspective to bear. Conduct which they cannot audit from their own experience, as they certainly can audit economic policy. Conduct which causes them trouble, worry, anxiety, concern, sends their sons abroad, gets them shot, puts their cities in jeopardy, for no clearly understandable reason that private experience can shed light upon. I'm not speaking only of ultimate choices, ultimate risks, a Cuban confrontation, but things as unfamiliar, as unfathomable, more limited than these. Things like limited intervention in Vietnam, accompanied by attempted disengagement in Laos. Things like intervention in Vietnam, but non-intervention in Cuba, at least non-intervention of the same sort. Things like support for a British nuclear force and perpetuation of the British nuclear deterrent, accompanied simultaneously by continued, reiterated opposition to a French deterrent. Things like an implicit acceptance of the risks involved in a test ban treaty, if one could get one, but no acceptance of the risks of nuclear disarmament. Things like budgeting for flexible response, for the ability to minimize the risks of which I speak by having at hand a variety of kinds of force, even, at worst, a variety of kinds of atomic force. Budgeting, even in some hope, to hold options open, to keep flexibility, to limit the costs of nuclear war. Budgeting of this sort at the cost of $10 billion of additional tax money annually. Never mind the rights or wrongs of these particular items. Not my purpose here. All these courses, or their opposites, transcend the personal experience, the personal base for judgment of most Americans. They have to be taken on faith. They call for confidence. And if one thing came clear in the Korean War, it is that Mr. Truman, right or wrong, good reasons or bad, doesn't matter, Mr. Truman had a very limited stock of confidence from the American public, whom he asked, from whom he exacted casualties, treasure, inflation, discomfort, for the most curious kind of thing. For hostilities in a country nobody had ever heard of, which were not to result in victory, although American wars always resulted in victory. And at the height of the Korean War, after the Chinese intervention, Mr. Truman's standing in the monthly Gallup polls in response to the question, do you approve of the way the President is conducting the government? Mr. Truman's standing registered 23% approval. Mr. Eisenhower's once fell to 49% briefly, but most of his administration had hovered in the 60s. Mr. Kennedy's administration has hovered in the 70s, or varied between the 70s and the 60s. The height of the Korean War, this complicated, unbelievable exercise, which violated all American notions of what war was supposed to be about and was conducted in a place nobody had ever heard of. 23% of those polled were prepared to express approval of the President's conduct. Now, any present or future president is bound, when he confronts the risks I have discussed tonight, is bound to think back to that experience, and it is bound to be a caution for him. It is bound, I think, to be an inhibition for him. The old presidency, which after all must coexist with the new one, the old criteria for effective leadership and the old techniques of leadership are, to some degree at least, changed in quality, inhibited by the risks attendant on the new presidency. What then, in these terms, is what my title calls for, the promise of presidential leadership? Well, the most one can hope from presidential leadership in terms of the new presidency is enough discretion in judgment, enough precision in orders, enough administrative control, enough option building to contain, to skirt, to minimize the risk of irreversibility become irremediable in the realm of foreign affairs wherever we touch upon the Cold War conflict. That is the only test one can make of presidential leadership. It's a very large one. This is now the sine qua non of our survival as a civilized society. Our situation is an advancing technology. Our domestic hopes and our domestic quarrels proceed within a framework. This test of leadership goes to the framework. When one confronts this situation, one is tempted to ask two questions, at least two. Both have been asked of me, and lest you ask them, let me anticipate them. There will be room for others. Let me anticipate these two. If this is the relevant test of leadership in the sphere of the new presidency, if it is a test of judgment and control and communication, how can one leave this sort of leadership to a mere human being? Well, the answer, of course, is obvious. We have nobody else to apply to. More seriously, how can we afford to leave such judgment to mere politicians? To this I can only answer, who else? Who better? The essence of our democratic theory is not voting per se. It's not the registering of public opinion per se. It's not the New England town meeting. The United States of America is no New England town meeting, never has been. The essence of our democratic theory is that human judgment on the use of governmental power, and here I have been dealing with the most elemental form of power. Human judgment on the use of governmental power should vest in those who have themselves experienced the hazards of party nomination and popular election. That judgment should vest in those whose responsiveness consists essentially of this experience, of an awareness of these hazards. The essence of the theory is the responsiveness. The test of responsiveness is the experience of nomination and election. Now, we have always thought in the past, I think so still, that this sort of awareness, this kind of experience, is an indispensable element in judgment on the use of governmental power. Indispensable, at least, if one hopes to retain the notion of representative government. Indispensable because people who have to run the risks, go through the hazards of nomination and election, are rendered specially sensitive to some very crucial things. Especially sensitive to the fact that in human society, in political society, interests actually differ. That men of goodwill, using their reason from their different perspectives, may arrive at opposite conclusions. And that there is no one right way, one sure path to bridge differences. There is not in human affairs, in social affairs, in political affairs, where force is involved, any solution that reason can claim is perfectly just. There is no solution that does not exalt some interests at the expense of others. And this is something politicians learn. It is something, unhappily, that a great many people in a great many other professions do not have to learn and do not learn where public affairs are concerned. Furthermore, the hazard of having to face the nominating process the electoral process. Put in the heads of politicians, at least sensitive, able ones, a real sense of limits, limits of solution, limits of support, limits of toleration. And if we believe in representative government, then we believe, most basically I think, in government in which decision-making is responsive to the tolerances of the voters. No one can sense this better than the elected politician. Or perhaps I should say, no one is in a better position to sense it than he. Now, politicians are as liable as anybody, and more liable than some perhaps, to misjudgment. The fact that their experience gives them special opportunities for valuable insight doesn't assure that they will acquire the insight or apply it. I do not speak in praise of them with any surety that one should have special confidence in them. Their judgment, however, informed by the risks they run in their profession, seems to me more reliable on the average than the judgment of any set of philosopher kings so far suggested for governmental decision-making. I do not exclude professors, lawyers, physicists. There is something about all rational men whose commitment is to that bedrock of our Western cultural tradition, the use of reason and the sovereignty of reason, that renders such men suspect as philosopher kings unless they've been subjected to the heartening, broadening perspective of something so unreasonable as an election. Now, in conclusion, in the perspective I've tried to give you tonight, the key problem of the American presidency now is not party reform, not programmatic purity, not leadership in the sense of effective persuasion of the public, though these are all vitally interesting, some of them vitally important to the healthy development of our society. But the key problem is a subtle and complex administrative problem, if you will. How so to inform the judgment of the governing politician? How so to activate his unique responsiveness, his insight? How so to secure that his will registers on his subordinates in time, registers in time on large-scale organizations, as to provide in the future the kind of care in judgment, surety in control, that under what might be called in some ways the specially favorable circumstances of last October characterized the Cuban confrontation. The promise of the presidency is that mere human material, mere politicians, may be able to learn to cope effectively with the inordinate demands made in modern circumstances upon men's minds and upon large-scale organizations. I say may. This may be too much to ask. But it may not. It is just possible that the people who feel human capabilities must be translated now out of all relation to what they were before may ask more than is actually necessary. No doubt, men's minds are not infinitely adaptable, and politicians' minds less than a good many. And no doubt, the imperatives of a large-scale organization interfere continually with close, refined, delicate control. Yet, if one takes a perspective, say, of 30 years, if one looks back to, say, the President, his chief aides, and his administrative mechanisms, and his means of obtaining information, and his means of applying judgment 30 years ago, one looks, say, at Mr. Roosevelt and the men around him, and then wonders what they would have done if faced with novelty and no preparation. For the dimensions of risk and the complications of administration I have suggested to you here tonight, I can only say that I think they would have been utterly at sea, utterly unable to grasp or operate in these circumstances. However limited the adaptability of human minds and human organizations, there has clearly been a remarkable amount of adaptation in 30 years. These new risks, these new dimensions, these new conditions which create what I've characterized here as the new presidency have been at least accompanied by new ways of thinking and new ways of acting and new ways of organizing. Change may proceed faster than our capacity to adapt. I don't know. But if there has been enormous change in recent years, there also has been, I believe, a very considerable degree of adaptation. And this, perhaps, is the most one can say of the promise of presidential leadership. Thank you.
I think I need add nothing to that applause as an indication of our indebtedness to Professor Niestadt for these thoughtful and persuasive comments on the risks and conditions involved in the conduct of what he styles the new presidency. Mr. Niestadt places great emphasis on the matter of judgment as a criterion in considering presidential leadership. Yet he himself begs off making any judgment of the Kennedy administration until 1957. 67. Well, he did it first, you know. You see, I'm still trying to keep up with him. On the other hand, he confided to me before the lecture proper that he is, in his own terms, a real question man, which is to say that he's not opposed to questions in general, just questions about judgment of the Kennedy administration. Certainly the nature of the subject is such, and the quality of Mr. Niestadt's perceptions of this subject is such, that he will have aroused in your minds a good many questions that you might wish to explore with him. In the confidence that that's true, let me turn him over to you and you over to him once again for whatever questions you might have. Again, Mr. Niestadt.
Thank you. I don't know whether smoking is permitted, but I saw somebody doing it.
Let's all do it.
And after this length of time, I can't resist anymore.
Well, that's the first question, and that's his. Now it's your turn.
I'm at your disposal, and I really don't bar questions about anything. Yes, sir. Well, I'm reminded about Mr. Truman's formula for ex-presidents. Oh, tie a stone to a rope, tie the rope around their necks, and chuck them into the Potomac. Look, there are no guarantees in politics. There are no guarantees in the history of rule. The rather remarkable thing about the American presidency up to now as an office of rulership is that it has sometimes had what you call weak men, or relatively ineffectual men, in performing the older tasks of leadership. But it has not, so far as I know, except in one case, had a man who was in the least irresponsible, or so imprecise in his perceptions that he could not exercise his desire to be responsible. The one case occurred, the only time in modern history, when one party was so confident at the time of nomination about its surety of election that it thought it would be better to get by with anybody than with somebody. Mr. Harding is a partial exception, not on responsibility, but on sheer capacity. Now, this is not a bad record. Beyond this, I don't see what one expects of a system. If you look at all systems and at their succession of rulers, you will have no particular reason to jump for joy about the certitude of sound judgment. But some risks in human society one simply cannot get out of. And I think your second question goes to one of them. As for your first question, I presume that in bracketing Mr. Rockefeller with Mr. Keating, you are thinking of criticisms of Cuban policy. Oh, not Mr. Rockefeller's recent criticism of European and NATO nuclear policy. Well, unquestionably, if it's hard to move against affirmatively. On the other hand, it is not impossible to withstand negatively. Mr. Truman only had 23% approval. And Mr. Truman's situation at the moment of MacArthur's great service for his country held Senate hearings of such a character that they dragged the issue out until everyone was bored to death with it. And that was not indeliberate. Mr. Truman was very limited in the affirmative things he could do. But he was not effectively limited in the things he could negatively withstand. One thing is clear about the present situation. So long as Mr. Kennedy is willing to run whatever political risks he finds in this sort of criticism, by refraining from action, or by tempering his action, the criticism cannot make him change, nor can the public. The public does not govern. But undoubtedly, if the criticism took hold and bit deep, he would pay a higher and higher price in the coin of other policies for sticking to this one. No doubt about it. I hope that's some kind of an answer at any rate. Yes, sir.
I think the president had said that he would debate an opponent in the 1964 election. Do you think that a new president in U.S. Army can afford such a public debate in the campaign?
Well, speaking as a student of the presidency, I was appalled by the alacrity with which he seized on an early question and early press conference, and quite deliberately, obviously, by his tone and manner, carried the 1960 debates into the 1964 election. But it's done now. It's undoable. We will have to live with this new phenomenon. As a student, I find it interesting. If I'd been asked, I would have recommended against it. But nobody asked me, so I'm entirely at liberty. It should be said, though, to complete my answer to your question, that my concerns are not quite the same as those implicit in your question. I think that in a television debate, the President of the United States can rise to and stand on his dignity and the national security at any time he chooses. I don't think that a non-presidential debater can force a president, particularly not one skillful at this technique, to put the dignity of his office at stake, or to get himself into ill-chosen, ill-advised commitments. The risk is there. But the risk is least for a man who would find this technique so desirable as a campaigning technique that he would, with alacrity, when first in the presidency, announce that he was happy to have it used again. My worries are of another sort. That in a way, one monkeys with the office in this new dimension, even though the president is too skillful to give anything away. One monkeys with it in ways I can't quite see the consequences of. And as I was introduced as a scholar politician, well, politicians, I am not one, I just study them. Politicians have very conservative instincts about things, the consequences of which they cannot calculate. Maybe I'm politician enough to feel the same way as a scholar on this score. Another question? Yes, sir.
Were you with ex-President Truman at the time the Chicago Tribune announced that Dewey had defeated him?
Well, I wasn't with him. I was back in Washington. Oh, he was on the train, as I recall. He treasured that moment, however. He had a picture of himself holding the thing, and he kept it around. He kept it handy. Yes, ma'am. Well, I'm not sure. The presidency has always, not always, but for a very long time, had a dual character, really a quadruple character. It has been a partisan office, and this is part of its strength. It's the one national office which forces state and local party organizations to coalesce. Oh, it's the one great stake of power that gives us any kind of national party system. And such claims as a president can make upon his partisans add something to his stature and his status and his ability to act. At the same time, it is increasingly an office of high national action, of the gravest and most dangerous sort. Yet the paradox where the president domestically is very limited, and where in certain critical spheres of foreign policy quite unlimited, except by his own responsiveness to the electorate. Now, one certainly would not want to elevate the presidency above politics. This would fatally weaken some of his sources of support. It would lessen his own responsiveness. But one wants to be very careful, it seems to me, about the emphasis one gives to the partisan political character of the office at a time when these other responsibilities have assumed their present character. That's all I express some nervousness about. If Mr. Kennedy performs, as I suspect he's able to, and does not commit indiscretions, he will have, there'll be no large damage to the office. But what happens as this becomes a tradition, irremediable? All presidents have to debate, all contenders always. 3 times running by 72, it'll be part of the Constitution. I rather hate the implications of it. Still, this is where we're going, so we might as well enjoy it. Yes, sir.
You're just raised a number of questions. I'll just ask one. In your excellent book, you at least popularized that point the phrase the Washington community, the Washington public. Explain what that meant. I assume most of us have read it. Would you be kind enough to give us the Washington community's estimate of the president? Perhaps not the president, perhaps take the time of last year's steel crisis, what they thought of the way he handled it. Could you do this?
Well, I said, since you quote me, that there usually is a dominant tone in what I call the Washington community's appraisal, the involved, the influential, the people whose business it is to watch what goes on in government, whether they're in Washington or not. I think that's still true. I will undertake to interpret the tone, but I'm after all only one interpreter. The tone may be there, but one has to be awfully cautious about being sure one's caught it right. On the steel thing, I think you have you had initially a sense the president's taken on more than he can chew, and at the end of the 72 hours, sense he chewed too hard. I think that sense persists. One incident of that sort does not make enough pattern to create a sort of solid tone to Washington appraisals. You begin to have a pattern when you take steel, add it to Oxford, add it to Cuba. Then contrast with the long agony, if that's the right term, over tax reduction. When, how much? I think one gets two kinds of dominant notes out of Washingtonians. One, this is a technically very skillful man in the fine work of negotiation, of inquiry, judgment, fine work. Two, this is a man capable when cornered, or when he feels the ground firm beneath his feet, of moving with decision and with extraordinary precision of execution in terms of keeping hold on the executive establishment. But that when he is neither cornered nor sure of his ground, he is exceedingly cautious and always testing ahead for ground. And if he doesn't find it, trying to accumulate some ground somewhere else. Trying always to hold options open, alternate courses of actions open, retreat, escape hatches open, to the point where I think the dominant judgment, dominant theme in the Washington community, it's not one I'm sure I share, is that he forecloses options on himself by the very effort to attempt to keep them all open. That's a complex phenomenon. In some ways, now reverting from the generalities of my guess as to the dominant theme of something as amorphous as the Washington community, I find it fascinating that Mr. Kennedy, whose attitude in Congress was always very much an executive attitude, and whose attitude toward Congress, even while in it, was always very much the attitude of the potential executive, is still in office a man who never experienced the wars of the bureaucracy from the inside. And still has some trouble, I think, perceiving all of what it is that goes on underneath it. He's still quite a new president from my perspective, but this is true. Also, his faithful learning of Rooseveltian lessons has, I think, perhaps been hard on him in one respect. Roosevelt delighted in keeping competitions boiling. That's right. When he did not know which way to go or wasn't sure where the ground was solid, let people push and press and see how the debate comes out. But in the years when Roosevelt did this with art and mastery, these were the earlier years. These were the years when all issues were public issues, when competitions were vetted by the press and the interest groups and the public, when a strong push in one direction was bound to bring into the open the oppositions, because the press was there and the public was there to do it. But now, in the spheres in which I've been talking, you deal with an inside structure. And to pull the Roosevelt technique successfully requires more than letting argument proceed. It requires making sure by affirmative action that the argument is going to be balanced. You can't count on the press and the public to do it for you. This would require an extraordinary skill at internal bureaucratic manipulations. I think Mr. Kennedy is still groping for that skill. He is not a man who has had. He's not a man who had what FDR had, and FDR is almost alone among our presidents in having it. For 7 years, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy when there only was one. For 7 years, he intrigued against the Secretary and the President. And Mr. Roosevelt knew precisely what undersecretaries did to presidents when he was president. What? One more.
In your book, you stated that power is persuasion. Tonight, you remarked that leadership is not persuasion but judgment. I doubt that there's a contradiction here, but I don't understand if you find anything.
Well, in a way, what I'm trying to do tonight is make distinctions, write that chapter that perhaps I should have written but didn't. Power is judgment in the employment of military force, period, so long as military forces abide by the American military tradition, at least. But, and so long as you can make your orders precise enough that they can be carried out, which is a part of, which is not, well, is both judgment and precision in communication. But there is damned little you can do with military force. You can, of course, by effective enough miscalculation and bureaucratic momentum, do a great deal physically with military force, but you can't accomplish a policy with it, or not with it alone. Nobody believes for a moment that a nuclear war with the Soviet Union is an extension of policy. It may occur, but it will occur as a matter of accident, not design. Force is very useful to hold options open for the achievement of policy by other means. It is very useful to prevent the foreclosure of policy. But it simply has, in a complex modern situation, terribly limited uses in affirmatively carrying on policy. Mr. Eisenhower used force in Little Rock. And what did he accomplish? He kept a mob from keeping Negro children out of school, but he could not, by the use of force, get the children educated. Mr. Kennedy, by the skillful employment of force, was able to blunt and reverse the psychological, primarily, and secondarily, the partial strategic effect of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. But he was neither able to turn the long-term contest with the Soviet Union to long-term advantage, nor, in the short term, to accomplish any of our substantive purposes regarding Cuba. Mr. Kennedy was able, with force, to get a student into the University of Mississippi. But he certainly was not able to accomplish the Supreme Court's purposes, the sociological objective, if you will, which integration in education was declared to be a constitutional right. Mr. Truman was able, with the use of force, to prevent the destruction of the South Korean regime. Had he followed General MacArthur's advice, he might have been able, with the use of sufficient force, to accomplish the unification of Korea, though it's hard to say at what cost, other objectives. But until now, Mr. Truman's use of force has not accomplished the substantive purpose declared by the United Nations as its objective for the Republic of Korea, North and South. Well, it's a paradox. The Use of force merely gives you opportunities for persuasion or forestalls their loss. It does not accomplish what persuasion must be employed to accomplish. Yet, of course, force has now reached such character that overuse, misuse, or mutually miscalculated use may, in a negative way, accomplish far more than force has ever been able to do before. Yet I dare say that sort of accomplishment is in nobody's arsenal of policy. I hope that helps.
Before you all run off, I want to point out that next week, next Thursday evening, when Mr. Niestadt is back either testifying in Washington or appearing before classes at Columbia University, when Professor Meyer is at the University of Michigan, when Mr. Pickering is sending rockets off to the moon, we will have the opportunity to hear Abraham Heschel, the distinguished professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary, speaking on the exile of humanity and reflecting upon the 3 lectures that we have so far heard in this series. I would urge you to come out and hear Professor Heschel. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.